Yeah. All right, there we go. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Danelle Crawford McKinney. I am the first Dakota woman who was ordained in the Dakota Presbytery of the Presbyterian Church USA. I'm not the first Native. I'm the fifth Native woman who was ordained. And I come from the, what some people know as a Sioux tribe, but we don't call ourselves that anymore. We call ourselves the Dakota people. So if you've heard of the Dakota, Nakota, Lakota people, that's basically the same group of people. We come from something called the Ocheti Sakowin, which means the Seven Council Fires. And we're basically just different bands, but we're identified as separate nations, but we're together. And so, so I live on the east side, the northeast side of South Dakota, and I'm really happy to be here. I really wanted to just kind of answer questions rather than say a lot of stuff. And I brought my sidekick here. We will be celebrating 27 years together on August 27th. So yeah, so yeah, so I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Ron McKinney from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. I grew up in southern Oklahoma, but I've been living in all different places, and we recently made a move here in Lawrence from one place to another. And as we were doing so, I was realizing how long we've already been here in Lawrence, and it's been 9 years. But it's good to see everyone. It has been a long year. It's been a year of twists and turns and struggles, and but hopefully things are looking up, and I look forward to participating more again and being active. One of the things that I've been doing just briefly is on Sunday mornings I have a lot of people on Facebook that are elderly, and so what I've been trying to do is read scriptures in Choctaw for them and sing hymns, try to just share that with people that may not be able to get out, or who miss going to their own congregations wherever they might be. So that's what I've been doing. At Dubuque Seminary, I had after college, I got a job at St. Joseph's Indian School in Chamberlain, South Dakota, and I worked there for 2 years when I decided to go to seminary. And so I spent that last year there getting ready to leave and to be a poor student again. And so when I visited the seminary there, they asked me if I'd ever heard of Danelle Crawford. And I said, no, I haven't. They said, well, she's getting ready to graduate in South Dakota, and then she's going to be coming as well. So I'd never heard of her. And afterwards, after we got to know each other and stuff, we found out there were like 5 occasions that we could have met while I lived there in South Dakota. But we didn't meet until we actually both arrived at the Dubuque Seminary.
Yep. So before we get started, I would like to, we always have to bring a gift in my culture. I don't know if you've read a lot in the book but we have to be generous. We have to share. And I so appreciate being asked to come and be a part of this today. But I wanted to offer you a gift. And I'm sorry I didn't have time to pick up anything, but I do want to share with you a song. And the song, I'm going to sing it in English because I don't trust my Dakota right off this morning. On a good day, I probably would, but today I don't. So I'm going to sing out of the Presbyterian hymnal. And it's a song that's, pretty close to what we're talking about. You know it as Many and Great, O God are thy things. I know it as Lac qui parle. And so it's a French word for an area where our people had this conflict that happened back in 1862. And 38 of our Dakota men were hanged. And before that happened, they sang this song. And a lot of people started crying, and they said, no, this is a day of victory. And so there's a lot of history of that. If you want to learn more about that, you can go to YouTube and watch the Dakota 38. It's a really powerful movie, and it's free. I think you can go to smoothfeather.org and you can watch it there as well. But anyway, this is the song that they sang, and I want to offer this as a gift to you today. Let us pray. Many and great, O God, are thy things, maker of earth and sky. Thy hands have set the heavens with stars. Thy fingers spread the mountains and plains. Lo, at thy word, the waters were formed. Deep seas obey thy voice. Amen. Okay. I'm not sure how you wanted to.
Well, you know, we have gifts too that we bring back
Oh.
there. If anybody has a gift to bring, we started a ceremony. Everybody brings a gift.
Oh, wow.
We got it picked it up right away in terms of remembrance ceremony. Thank you for bringing it up. We got there. Okay. Larry, there's a carol here.
There we go. It's a lot easier.
Well, you know, I would like to hear some about what you're doing with the Presbyterian Church.
Okay, yeah, that's good. That's good. And it's good we talk about that right away because I don't want to forget about it. So we have been working on the national level of the Presbyterian Church. And there's going to be an event July 23rd through the 27th. August. I'm sorry. August 23rd through the 27th. And the Presbyterian Church USA, and I think you go to pcusa.org. I think that's where it's going to be.
It has its own webpage.
Oh, it does have its own. Okay.
Week of Action, PCUSA
Yeah.
Action.
Yes, Week of Action.
Yeah.
So on Thursday will be the Native American, the Indigenous Peoples Day. So all different groups are going to be recognized, but Thursday is going to be the Indigenous Peoples Day. And one of the focuses that they want to have is on the MMIW, or the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. But it's hard for us to just focus on one thing when it talks about issues of like MMIW, because, you know, right now what's really up and coming are the 215 children that were found buried at a residential school in Canada. And now there are many others. They're starting to search all of these residential schools to see if they can find remains of children that were murdered and stolen from their families and murdered and then just buried there. And yes, there's a lot. They haven't even started talking about this in America yet, but they need to. So Haskell, I don't know if any of you know, but Haskell has a graveyard there. We've been kind of keepers of the people that were there, but there are more that we weren't aware of, but they're there in the wetlands. And then there's some in where the former agency where I lived in Flandreau, South Dakota, there's a graveyard back there as well. So we know that there are places there. We just need to start searching. So that's a major issue as well. But on Thursday, on the Indigenous Peoples Day, through the Presbyterian Church, we're going to do some activities. There will be a little bit of sharing. One of the things about MMIW is we don't like to share a lot of stories, but we like to kind of give people a little bit of the issues that are surrounding what's going on with that. And a lot of it has to do with violence against women. You know, a lot of times people ask victims, well, why didn't you do this? Or why didn't you do this? And really, that's not really why part of the reason why we don't want to share the stories, because we don't want to be faced with, why did you not do this? Why weren't you smarter about this? It's not the point that, you know, it doesn't change what happened. What happens is now we're at where we're at. And so a lot of times people try to blame the victims for their plight and for what happens. And that's really not helpful right now. So those are some of the things that we're going to be talking about on that day. So I'd really like to encourage you to go there and learn more about that. So we have been talking in the church about possibly looking at this. There's actually two separate factions that we have to deal with in terms of working with Indigenous people. So the Indigenous people have their own way of coming to the realization of what happened. And that's going to take a lot longer than people looking at the situation and say, what has the church done and how can we fix that? And so that seems like that would be a shorter term issue, but it's not. It's going to be quite a long term. So those are some of the things that we're doing right now. We're looking at what ways we can try to break down those barriers that keep us going. And I've been on I don't know if you all know this, but I've been serving on the Presbyterian Women Board of Directors, and my term ends next month. So it has been a very educational experience for me to understand a little bit more about who I am as a Indigenous person and who I am as a Presbyterian. And so trying to walk that balance has been very interesting for me as we go through that. So, but yeah, that's kind of what we're doing right now. Ron can speak a little bit more about the doctrine of discovery and the work that you all are doing with that.
Well, I've been serving as on the committee that was appointed by the General Assembly. And so before COVID, we were meeting regularly and planning these different events and planning to assist churches and presbyteries that were wanting to address some of those issues and help education. After COVID, we've had to, like everyone else, we've had to adjust and do things online. One event that Danelle and I were a part of was a discussion group with a church in, was that Kansas City?
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was good because one of the things about technology is that you don't have to be present there, so there were people in that session that were, or in that group that were actually from California, so they were able to go back and tell their community about these issues. And so, that's one of the things that we've had to work on. And I also serve as one of the co-moderators for Presbyterian Men's, Native American Presbyterian Men's camp, or not camp, but group. So we were planning to have a national gathering last summer as well, and that got canceled. So we've been looking at different ways in which we can still connect with our Native American Presbyterians, which is very difficult in some places. One of our committee members, he has to go to a house that's up on top of the hill to get internet. And sometimes, even working with the youth, sometimes they have to go to someone else's house, or they have to go to a store or somewhere, and just to get a signal, So we've been working with that, and then now we're at a point where we're kind of collectively thinking about the possibilities of having events together. So like the Native American men's, Native American women's, I think the youth are still planning an event for next summer. But you know, it's been a challenge to overcome these distance issues and travel bans in the PCUSA. But I think we're at a point now where we're starting to figure out how we're going to pick up where we were and to be able to continue on and still be able to do the work that needs to be done and getting the information out and about these different issues. So.
One of the things that, he's talking about, dealing with these issues, one of the things that I found recently in working with the General Assembly, the National Church on this event that we're working on, I was really reluctant to work with the MMIW. And it was not because I don't care about the issue, but once I finally gave in and started working on it, it realized that, it triggers a trauma in me. And so it's really, really difficult sometimes for Indigenous people to talk about some of these issues because many of them haven't even begun to process it yet. And when we do, we don't have a landing for us. We can present, we can tell what we know, but then we have to go somewhere and have to process everything that we've dealt with. And every time we talk to somebody, we have to do that every time because we have to deal with all of those issues, those emotions that are involved in that. And so, so it's been very difficult for us. And I know it's difficult for our children as well, probably even more so now because they are experiencing situations of MMIW with friends, with communities that they're living in, and they're understanding the impact that it's having, not just on the people they're working with, but themselves and the areas that we come from. And so when you learn more about what's in the book about being connected, it goes much deeper than just having a relationship. It's being, it's kind of like what she talks about, and I don't know, maybe I'm giving it away, about the braiding sweetgrass, about how they're so intertwined together. And we're so intertwined with our future, our present, and our past. We're so intricately entwined into that. We're intricately entwined in our families, in our communities, and the families we work with. And so it makes it very difficult because what our children are going through, we're going through. What our grandparents went through, we're going through. So we always have that whole balance that's going on. And so it's difficult for us sometimes because we always have to deal with that. And even when we experience issues of systemic racism in everyday life, we have to deal with that every day. I am reminded every day that I am a Native person, that I'm Indigenous, and that I belong in a systemic racist society. And I'm not saying that to try to hurt you. By me coming and singing, I wanted you to know that I come to you in a good way. I'm just trying to help you to see where we're coming from, why sometimes it's difficult for us to discuss some of these issues because we're dealing with our trauma as we deal with it. But yet we also want to be committed to making sure that people are aware, people are educated about what we're dealing with and about the issues that we have to face every day. And it's not anything different than anybody else faces every day. It's just that it reminds us of things that have happened to our relatives. And that wasn't even that long ago, 1 or 2 generations ago. We all have been faced with the issue of the residential schools. Not a single Indigenous person in the world today has not been affected by residential schools, at least in America and Canada. So that was a harsh realization for us when we saw that we were all affected by it. And so that's something that we are just now starting to process. And so, okay, yeah. So I do want to make sure we have time. I want to answer your questions more than just me telling you what's going on. So you have a question.
I was just going to say that I'm originally from Canada, and I was up visiting my sister in British Columbia about 5 or 6 years ago, and they were just finishing up a 5-year program of reconciliation. And it was really interesting to see the communities, meeting the indigenous and the regular churches. My brother-in-law is a pastor in a Baptist church in Burnaby, British Columbia, and they would meet together and they would learn over a period of time. But it was shocking that I heard about the residential school where they found the bodies, because I don't think that ever came up to that degree during that period.
Yeah.
Do you have any idea?
You know, working in residential schools, we know that that's there. But as Indigenous people, we didn't, I've been thinking about that a lot since I've been hearing about this. I worked in the place where these atrocities occurred. And in some ways, I didn't feel like I was furthering the violence that took place. In a way, I kind of felt like I was a keeper of the people that were there before me. And so I didn't really think about the actual stories of the individual people until some of the elders started sharing those stories. You just think, oh, they went to school here. They're like the children that we work with every day. They're learning, they're going back, the violence is gone. The whole idea of, killing the Indian, save the man, has left. But yet we haven't dealt with the fact that was there. We look at it from a perspective of a historical fact. We haven't really had a chance to deal with that emotionally, to say, because my grandfather went to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. And I know the stories about what happened when he couldn't speak his language anymore, but I hadn't had a chance to really fully understand what that was like for him. It was historical fact. That's basically where we were at on that. And now we're just starting to realize the impact of emotionally what that meant, how that affects me now, how, my grandparents really pushed us to be a part of what I call the Reformed tradition, which is Presbyterians, Lutherans, they felt like that was their way of saving us. And in many ways it did, but in many ways now we have to deal with all that. So yeah, that's a good point.
I know in Kimber, she has this great chapter she deals with, sitting underneath pine on the West Coast. And then she talks about invasive species and settlers, basically the metaphor, and how at first she realized this is negative. And yet it's the white man's planting and everything like that. All of a sudden she realized, well, there are gifts in that too. After
Yes.
4 generations. But it sort of leads into this whole idea of kind of a quote, post-colonial church. It is the issue of how do we find gifts in the invasive, the settler. We didn't do that, but we're still responsible as far as predominant culture. So I'm wondering, and also the challenge that you all have gone through. I think when Tinker was here, the theologian in residence, he moved from his Lutheran Christianity and he quit it and he went over. But I still remember him being at Haskell and speaking to Haskell, and he respected everyone that got up. If they were Christian or indigenous religious perspective. He just listened. And I thought that was a great model in terms of a way of how he, and I know there's a struggle, I think, among a lot of Native indigenous people, if I'm Christian or not Christian, or how do I deal with the settler invasive species.
Yes.
I'm rambling on, but you get
No.
the idea.
Yes. Yes, I do.
How you feel.
I think going along with the issue of MMIW, and I think part of it is now there's a voice that's being heard. And what you were asking, why didn't this come up before? I don't think that voice was being heard at that time. And part of that is who's telling the history of what took place. We all have this romanticized, we're brought up with that here in this country, this romanticized account of what took place. There's always, every community, probably in every state, there's always the chief's daughter who went to be, with the settlers and showed them the way and took them, different places, and like in the movies Pocahontas or Sacagawea, those are all romanticized events. But what really took place there? These young girls were taken. So whose history are we learning? The romanticized version of, they sacrificed themselves for they fell in love with the settlers or the invasive species, as you just said. So now we're at a point where we're saying, wait a minute, that's not our history of what took place. This is our history. Our children were stolen. Our grandparents and their parents were taken from their families. And if you think about a 4-year-old being taken from their family and not being released until they're 18 or 20, that's a lot of damage done psychologically, emotionally. They don't grow up in the system that they were born into and they had become accustomed to. But yet history, we gloss over it because we don't want to see that kind of reality. So again, we have to ask who's telling the story, and that kind of glosses over some of that.
Yes. Okay, you had a question.
I have to acknowledge that I grew up on a farm that was homesteaded in 1857 from land that was stolen in central Kansas. But I'm a 5th generation, and my children are the 6th generation of taking care of that land. And so I understand the feeling and the need. But we came from a different, we come from where we own that land, and the nations that were there before us took care of the land in Rome. So I understand the difference. There's so many layers to what you're talking about, and we're just trying to start to peel back the first layer, and we're going to start with an acknowledgement, a statement of acknowledgement. What I'm wondering, and that's what we've asked of you, what I'm wondering, what can we do with you, with your work, and with the work with Haskell, the work here and now, to help with this process of dealing with the intergenerational, intertwined, all the traumas that have gone on are still going on. What can we as a people here in our church do?
Okay, so one of the things that I see as part of that, and I'll be honest, there's a lot of the stuff I don't know. I mean, I'm just now coming to the realization that there is these two factions. There's, it's almost like we're standing on a bridge and we see our indigenous people, our communities, our ancestors, our relatives who are just now trying to deal with what's happened. And then we're on the other side of the bridge. We see our friends, our relatives who want to know, how can we fix this? And one of the things that I see as a key component is just being ready to help them process what's going on, to listen to the stories, to understand. And there are some mentalities that need to be broken down. You talk about this land that you own, okay? You talk about this land that you have been having for centuries, okay? And that's fine. This is an area that you feel you can take care of and that you can be a keeper of. But when you really think about it, generations from now, will you still own that land?
I don't own it now. The land owns me.
Yeah, okay, there we go. There, yes.
If I say I understand, but legally. yeah,
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, so
The way
legally,
our
there's
society
this
is set.
legalistic issue, but then there's this part about the land that has nothing to do, has nothing to do with the piece of paper. It has everything to do with what that connection that we have. And I think that's what she's trying to get at in the book, is just understanding that, while we are here, we want to be able to make sure that we honor that, and when we remember the people that were there, before us, we still honor that in that way, so yes, so you are on a good path to understanding. We're saying, I don't own the land, that the land owns me. That's telling me you have a better relationship with that land than, rather than just saying, this is mine, no one's gonna come here. I'm gonna, it's how there's a difference between a defensive and an understanding of, this is a part of who I am. Yeah. Okay.
Languages, you each grew up speaking different languages. What about young people, people under 18 or under 20? Are they learning?
Okay. That's a really good question. The language, I did not grow up speaking Dakota. I grew up in an English speaking world, because of the residential schools. My grandfather would be hit if he spoke his language, even though he knew it till the day he died. He couldn't speak it. So I grew up only speaking English. My children understand my language way better than I do. And so I'm having to relearn who I am as Dakota through the Dakota language, through those eyes, through those lens. And so our children are actually better at it than I am. And their children are probably even going to be better at that. So we have 2 grandsons, and they speak several different languages. They speak Nez Perce because their father's Nez Perce and Yakima. Then they speak, when I deal with them and my family deals with them, we speak Dakota. And when they speak to Ron and his family, they speak Choctaw. And we mix interchangeably, but they seem to get it. So it sounds crazy, but even my daughter, you all know Madison, but she'll speak Dakota and Choctaw at the same time. She understands that language, but she's more in relationship to that language than we are just learning the semantics of it, like, oh, this is how we say it, She took some classes over COVID. They taught us some classes, but they didn't just teach us the ins and outs of the language. They taught us the literal meaning of what it meant. So it took a long time, because you could say one word and it means a whole bunch of stuff. And so now she's starting to take class with Choctaw. And so
One of the things that is the irony in this whole situation is that as far as for the Choctaw people anyway, it was the church that saved our language. Because growing up, I grew up in the churches where the scriptures were read in Choctaw, the hymns were sung in Choctaw, the sermons were preached in Choctaw. And so it was like that for a long time. And now the tribe, the Choctaw Nation, has started initiatives. They have classes that you can take, just community, if you want to learn more about the language. There's beginners. You can take it for college credit. It's all online. They started this, several years back, but now that with COVID, many of our first language speakers have gone. And so they are really, really pushing now for people that are like myself. My grandmother, she was one of ones that didn't go to the boarding school. She was kept home because she was the oldest and she had to help take care of other siblings. And but she only spoke Choctaw. She had no formal education. There were phrases that she could say in English, but mostly she just spoke Choctaw. And so when my mom went to school, first grade, she didn't know any English. And so she remembers the trauma she experienced from not being able to understand. And if it wasn't for other students there that were able to help her, to begin to understand what was going on. So when we were growing up, our first language was English so that we could function. But when we were at home, our parents, they were very bilingual. So it was just built in, it was speaking English, but Choctaw words inserted, or speaking Choctaw with English words inserted. And so when we started having children, we were intentional about using those words and languages. So even though our children are formally learning the language, they know words and phrases, that they can pick that up. And it has created some kind of humorous issues, like when they go to school and they start identifying things, they might have learned it in the language. So like our oldest daughter, Alethea, when she went to school, they told her this is watermelon. And she said, no, that's shukshi. And they had to work she had to work through that process, So there's little things like that, but it's something that's built in that, you don't realize how much you know until you really start examining it. So, but there are, like I said, and she said too, there's a lot of effort now from different tribal nations to really retain those languages because of so many first language speakers that have passed on.
Yeah, and one of the other interesting things too about the language is that when I was learning those classes, you're spending so much time and you get to a point where you can't even speak English anymore. The teachers won't allow you to speak it. So there's been times when we would come out of class and we're like, I don't even know if I could speak English anymore because you're so involved in that whole mindset. It's a different mindset that, I'm the closest thing I can think of is like transitive and intransitive verbs. How some of them you can, they come from like a receiving end of it, like you can speak like something like I'm doing something or I'm having something being done to me. And so you see the little differences there. And that's kind of like what that language is like, learning that. It's not about an active, I'm doing something as much as I'm in relationship with what's happening around me. So it's a whole different kind of mindset, and it's difficult, it's challenging, but at the same time, it's really helped us to understand a lot of things more clearly. So you have a question and I'll get to you next.
Two things. I kind of wrestle. I'm not sure I totally get the need to substitute Indigenous for Native American. Why do we now say Indigenous? Because to me, anybody who lived here in the beginning is Native American. That's the way I've looked at it.
Well, there's groups of people out there that say, well, I was born in America. I was born in this country.
So I'm native.
Right.
So they consider themselves Native Americans in the sense of they were born in this country, regardless of what their heritage might be. So this is more identifying not just in the US, but in Canada and Mexico and all through, around the world. It's more, it closer identifies that we were a part of this land, not just
It's
the
more of a
political
connection.
borders,
Yeah. it's more of a connection to the land.
My other,
But the
Go
other
ahead.
thing I'll say to that as well is when we use the term indigenous now, Ron and I, we weren't raised to say that. We do it out of respect for the younger people who prefer that term. So I don't always have to understand it fully, but out of respect for them, that's what they want to hear. And that's why I do it. Eventually, I'll understand. I'll come to understand why it's important to them. But for now, I know it's important to them. And that's why I use that term, because that's what they prefer. Okay, go ahead.
the other question was, do you ever feel sort of overshadowed by all the emphasis on Black race and the interracial problems there that seem to kind of overshadow Native Americans?
Well, that's one of the work that that's what we've been working with in the PCUSA, is to make sure that that voice continues on, so that the overtures that were passed in the at the General Assembly in 2016 don't just kind of fade away, and and that part of this activities week that's coming up in August, that's a part of that, is to make sure that that voice is still being heard even amidst all the other groups and issues that are going to be focused on during that week. I think that's just something that we've.
But Black Lives Matter seems to overshadow.
It appears that way, but I don't see it that way.
Well, I hope not.
I see it as more of, kind of like, how you see geese flying and you have the one in the lead going and everybody's kind of along with them. I kind of see it like that, it's we're trying to get to the end goal. We're all trying to achieve the one thing. And that is, there are several of us that are experiencing the systemic racism. And so I'm not mad that they get more attention or anything like that. I'm happy that they're having impact. And if they're having impact, we can have impact. The Asian people can have impact. Everyone else can have impact. It's only going to better us if we continue on that whole. So Madison did go and participate in Black Lives Matter protests. She went to where George Floyd was killed. And, I was really afraid, but at the same time, I couldn't stop her. And I'm glad she did, because it really helped her to understand this whole process even better. And so, yes, I don't feel like that I'm overshadowed or that we're being discounted. If they're listening to Black Lives Matter, they're eventually going to listen to the indigenous people. They're going to eventually listen to Asian and all the other groups that are out there.
And I think that's important for the post-colonial church
Yes.
to realize, is that it's not just one voice that's going to tell the whole story for everyone. It's multiple voices, multiple groups of people that have stories to share. Just like when you put on a glove, there's a place for every finger. So that's what the church has to come to realize, that it's not just one thing as told by whoever's in charge, but everyone is welcomed at that table, and all the voices need to be heard.
Well, my limited knowledge, I always felt like Native Americans or indigenous, whichever, were treated as bad as the slaves that were brought from Africa. It's just that kind of
Yes.
gets the press. Or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah. And in many ways, it's probably worse. But at the same
exactly.
time, if someone's having an impact, we celebrate that, because eventually it's a learning process.
I grew up 2 blocks from the Shawnee Indian Mission.
Oh,
Methodist, and we went through there numerous times touring, but I don't know that we were ever really taught what went on there.
Yes, I agree. Okay, yeah.
This is back to the language. I was wondering if, like in Choctaw language, if there are different variations of that. I have a good friend who couldn't wait to get to college to take German, because his parents, whenever they didn't want the kids to know, they spoke in German. And then he was so disappointed because the German that is taught
Yeah.
at the higher level of education was not the lower German that his parents spoke.
Yes,
And I wondered if you run into that with your language.
yes.
It varies from, like, our people originally were in the central Mississippi, Alabama area. And after the removal, then there became a gap. So, and by that time, missionaries had come in, and we had parts of the Bible already translated. It became a written language at that point. And then hymns were written. And so the Choctaws in Oklahoma stayed with that. And the Choctaws that remained in Mississippi continued on with an oral language. So there became a kind of a gulf in between there. So there are similarities, but there are also some differences. And then along the way, groups would stop. So down in Louisiana, there are groups of Choctaws that during the removal, they just stayed where they were at. And so there's a little, dialectic differences there as well. And even into Alabama, there's a group there. So it just depends, all languages kind of evolve and kind of change, and people use slang. So it's kind of like that.
And at linguists, they study languages like this. I know we had a good friend that would go out, and I'm not sure what tribe or what group he was working with, but trying to learn their language, and he wanted to write it. That was a big.
Yeah, and that is something that, when you're writing it or you're reading it, it looks different than when you're speaking it, because an oral language, your punctuation are said or spoken in word, so that, when you write it out and you use modern day punctuation, you're kind of redundant in something. So if I use the word hockey at the end of a sentence and then I put an exclamation mark, it's the same thing. But in the oral language, I wouldn't have to worry about that exclamation mark, so.
Charles?
Well, it kind of addressed what as my understanding is the indigenous people did not have a dictionary, a written history of the language and the definition of words and so forth. Do they now? I mean, how far back would we have to go in history to find that a language had been written and described in a dictionary form?
Yeah.
Missionaries,
Yeah, that's,
missionary days.
yeah,
Okay,
that's as
so
far as it goes.
So when they went into these residential schools, is that what you call them?
Mhm.
That's when missionaries helped the indigenous people put in paper what they've been saying to each other for a long time.
Well, actually, that's a little later.
Yeah.
Okay,
The residential school started later in the 1800s.
okay,
So prior to that,
Missionary.
missionaries came to the people and lived there with them. And most of them lived their lives out with a group of people, and they helped translate. So like for the Choctaws, we look at Cyrus Byington as a Presbyterian minister that came in and spent the rest of his life with our people, even through the removal. He went through the removal with the people, and he spent his life translating and creating a dictionary and hymns, and then other missionaries that came were under him. So he helped them develop this system. But it wasn't until later on then the schools began. And so that came a little bit later.
I just wonder if the indigenous people felt that was a benefit to them. Because what I'm seeing is that the missionary, in order to understand who he's working with, had to see the words in writing because that's how he was taught.
Yeah.
You know, he brought it over when he came. And so in order to understand the people he was working with, he asked the people he was working with, help me get this on written form so I can understand it better.
Yeah.
I guess that's
It was
what you're
basically
saying.
just conversations. It was conversations that were used for them to put it in there. At the time, I don't think anybody thought it was beneficial, but now we recognize that it was. And so for the Dakota people, Williamson and Riggs, there were two missionaries that came out under the Presbyterian Board of Missions, and they were the ones that helped establish the Dakota language. I'm not sure who established the ones for the Lakota, but there were missionaries who did the same. And prior to that, it was mainly an oral language, but there are places where you could see they did winter counts and they used pictures for the winter counts. And so a lot of times they would take that, put those pictures on the ledgers. So a lot of times you might see modern art now, it looks like it's on a ledger, and then they have all these, that's what the winter count was used for, but they learned how to put the pictures on there rather than write anything out.
You mentioned decolonizing with the Presbyterian Church and the Beloved. We're considering books to read this next, whatever semester. Are you aware of any good books for a group about decolonizing the church?
That's a good question.
I mean, the church, as opposed to just society, you know?
I guess what I would consider if, and I'm not sure exactly when you want to decolonize or when you want to look at a post-colonial church, are you specifically talking that in terms of indigenous people, or are you looking at it in terms of dismantling the systemic racism?
Well, maybe both, but
Okay.
right now I'm addressing the indigenous.
Okay. So I guess if I were someone who was looking at a post-colonial church, I would probably look at the virtues of different tribes that are there, learn about those virtues and how that relates to the scriptures in order to be able to look at how you're going to be able to help the future generations understand what that looks like.
Mhm,
Okay.
mhm.
So with that being said, I guess I'll go with what I think on our Dakota way, but there's a book called The Lakota Way. And I know I've mentioned this before, it's kind of older now, but there's a book called The Lakota Way, and it's by Joseph Marshall III. And it talks about, I think there's 7 or 9 virtues of the Lakota people. And these virtues are similar what you could find in the scriptures, but when he describes those virtues, he tells it in a story like Sky Woman Falling. So that would help. I think that could be a good start to try to figure out what's the value system there and how can we take that value, look at the scriptures and find a way to make those kind of mix together. Okay. So the whole process, you know, with the residential boarding school, I can't believe we keep coming back to that conversation, but there was a separation. You either are Christian or you're what we consider traditional. You know, now we are starting to recognize we are both Christian and traditional. And how are we going to help our kids understand that there's good in both, just like what we were talking about with the invasive species? How are we going to get them all to come together to find a way that's a little more, you know, a better balance between all of those? You know, and same with like, well, one of the things that I always love when I met Ron, one of the things he always told me, and it's just stuck with me all these years, was that he said, you can always add one. You know, you can't ever take anything away, but even though that's kind of what the residential schools tried to do, you can always add one. And so that, I think, is the way that we need to look at our post-colonial church. is finding those ways, finding those common grounds and making that work. Yes.
I think this brings up Ron's very nice analogy of a glove. That, I think if we could change gloves into mittens,
Yeah.
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 well, I am glad to know that Choctaw is spoken with an Oklahoma accent.
Yeah, it is.
It is actually.
It is, yeah.
Do you
And
have
I-
any ideas about post-colonial?
Well, I think too, as collectively as a church and individually as a part of a community, you have to just think about where you want to be. You know, what is your idea about this journey that you're on, and where you see yourself being 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Because for some, eh, you know, this is a process of just understanding and being able to be open to hear what is being said. But for some, it's going to be, you know, like for our daughter's generation, this is going to be the rest of her life, this post-colonial church. So what is it going to, how is she going to help build that? And I think one of the things that generation, you know, is their voices are being shared online and through the PCUSA. If you look at, what is it, Justice Unbound or Unbound? Something.
Yeah, just no.
It's a monthly publication. There's a lot of young people that are writing stories about their experiences. There's with this week of activities that's coming up, there's things like that are happening that this younger generation, they're building. They're building this church online, this community. So as us older people, we have to think about where, you know, what is it going to be for us? You know, is it just to help us to understand what can we contribute to that? And one of the ways is to begin to hear those stories, is to go to these websites and to say, well, you know, just for instance, you know, I want to hear this person's story about whatever, you know, topic it is or something, and their experience, because they're not just writing about historical events. They're writing about, this is happening right now. This is how it is affecting my life. This is going to be something that's going to be with them for the rest of their lives. So we have to be able to be visionary, I guess, of how we want to see this church. You know, is it going to be brick and mortar? Is it going to be online? You know, is the church Sunday morning coming together, or is it an activity event week? You know, even with my tribe and some of the language programs they have, you go to their website and there's a story you read and you answer these questions, and you know, it's not necessarily interactive, but some of the activities are interactive where you're in a group chat, you know. So those are some of the things that this younger generation that is building this church and having voice that they're doing. And so, you know, we have to be, like I said, we have to ask ourselves, where do I want to be? Is this just to help me understand, or am I going to be a part of that? And if I am, then I have to start reading and understanding what they're saying and hearing their voices.
Do you have any resources or books that you would encourage people to learn about, like with Choctaw values?
Let's see. I as far as Choctaw specific, I don't think so right off. I mean, I can't think of any one particular one right off, but I guess I would just focus it more on what the church can do. So.
And what was the name of that 38? I didn't get it.
Oh, Dakota
I'll send that out to
38.
everybody. I'll send that out.
Okay.
That is a powerful thing, and about Abraham Lincoln's involvement in that and all. It's a powerful story.
Yeah, I know a lot of people think, oh, Abraham Lincoln did so much, and and it was so powerful back in 2011. I took the kids to Lincoln Memorial, and as hard as it was for us, we put tobacco down at the feet of the statue of Abraham Lincoln to say that, we're still here. And, it's kind of like the issue about the story of the Wendigo. There's always going to be this force that tries to overcome us. And one of the things that that Madison and the younger generation are talking about was that, yes, we've had these atrocities happen to us. We've had these things that took place, but yet our ancestors also gave us the resilience to be able to withstand. And so I'm so proud of our younger people. They're so strong, despite all of the challenges that we've had over this last year. They're very strong, and they're still committed to being able to help and to fix that. Ron and I have always believed that we were bridging a gap. I think Madison's generation are thinking, no, we're paving a way. And it's a lot different mindset. We were trying to make sure that we honored both sides, but they have a whole different viewpoint than we do. And we still want to honor that. That's our old school mentality, I guess. And we appreciate what the young people are teaching us, and we want to be able to continue to help other people understand their path and what they're on and where they're going.
Well, I'll tell you, just because of time, I hope everybody reads page 305. And it has that thing of the Wendigo process. It's about what monsters does our society create, and how do they reflect the collective fears and deepest values. And Kimmer writes, born of our fears and our failings, Wendigo is the name for that within us, which cares more for its own survival than for anything else. That's worth us rereading.
Yes.
What does that say in terms of the church and how we face that reality?
Yes.
You all have been wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for your questions, and thanks.
That means we get to see you again, huh?
Sure.
How is Ralston doing?
Oh,
that I know where the
he's
front
doing
door
well.
What's he
When you see the drive, that's
Well, I
the
just
important
see
thing when you
him.
get there.
Oh, he's
Okay, good. Well, then you just put it right
You wouldn't
there.
recognize him.
I remember when he went to Wednesdays and wearing a suit.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he's.
I wear both eyes. and
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you
he's
just
gotten
wear your-
used to
yeah,
shorts and
wear your
t-shirts
mask.
now, but he's ready to get back to, dressing up again, but.